Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this final edition of Commonwealth Communities, a virtual symposium designed for local government staff, and elected officials in Massachusetts. We're thrilled to be adding zoning reform to the agenda. We added this 5th session because of the popular demand and interest in the topic. Our symposium today is hosted by Smart Growth America and LOCUS in partnership with the Barr Foundation. We want to extend a special thank you to the Barr Foundation for their partnership on this event and a related program of work. We wanted to let everyone know that all 5 sessions, and we hope you've been able, to join us for some of the earlier sessions, are available recorded on Smart Growth America's YouTube channel. We'll also be circulating program materials after the end of the event series. Please do feel free to share these with your friends and colleagues. By way of a quick introduction, in case you don't know Smart Growth America, we are a national nonprofit organization. We work with elected officials at all levels, as well as real estate developers, chambers of commerce, transportation and urban planning professionals, and residents to improve everyday life for people across the country through better development. Our North Star is that we envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We empower communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to create livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. I'm Marta Goldsmith, Director of the Form-Based Codes Institute at Smart Growth America. The mission of FBCI is to advance zoning reform through the use of form-based codes that empower communities to achieve their vision of livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. FBCI does our work through the classes we offer, technical assistance, research, thought leadership, and advocacy. LOCUS SGA is the program sponsoring Commonwealth Communities, is the preeminent coalition of real estate developers and investors committed to a triple bottom line outcomes, who advocate for policies to advance equitable development and smart growth. So I'm delighted to introduce you to our moderator for today, Doug Landry. In fact, Doug has moderated the previous 4 sessions, and I think you're in for a real treat. Doug is the Boston office lead for Langen Engineering, a longtime member of LOCUS National Steering Committee and president of LOCUS Massachusetts. Doug has been instrumental not only in moderating these sessions, but also in helping us put them together. So I'll turn it over to Doug now, who will introduce our panelists for today. Doug, welcome.
Thanks, Marta. Much appreciated. Again, thank you, Smart Growth America and the Barr Foundation for making this series possible. This has been a really just a tremendous experience putting this together over the past few months, listening to the various panelists and the various topics that we've brought to you with a Massachusetts twist. There's been a lot of panelists who've been outside of the region, and we've had some folks on panels who are within the region, and it's been a great mix of expertise and ideas that have been brought to the table during this whole process. So this particular session here, I'm really excited about. This is a bonus session. We originally planned on 4 of these sessions, and this is the 5th one around equity and zoning, which is a particularly relevant topic for Massachusetts. It always is. But coming out of the pandemic here and knowing that the governor's housing choice reform bill got passed last year, there's a lot of talk, as always, about zoning in Massachusetts. So this is going to be a really great panel. I've previewed the session here, and I just cannot wait for it to get started. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. But welcome everybody. Again, we have a really great spread of folks attending this call throughout Massachusetts, literally all 4 corners of the state. We have a lot of out-of-state participants from Texas, Florida, Wisconsin, elsewhere. And as Marta said, these are available on the YouTube channel for Smart Growth America. So if you missed one or want to want to re-listen or rewatch, those will be available as well. So let's get started. We'll do some quick intros. We're going to ask each panelist to talk about an example of how conventional zoning has resulted in an intentional or unintentional inequities as they sort of introduce themselves. We'll do it in the order of the way that they will be presenting today. So the first one up is Tracy Haddon-Lowe. Tracy, if you want to come on camera. Hello there. How are you?
Good morning, Doug. How are you?
Tracy is a fellow at the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metro. So Tracy, what's an example of an unintentional or intentional inequitable consequence of zoning that you've run across?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Doug. Okay, I'm gonna launch straight into sharing my screen, if that's okay. I'm just gonna, I think I need to be given permission to do that. But a picture is worth 1,000 words to answer this question, and so I just have a picture that I want to share with you guys. Okay, is this working? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yep.
So what I'm showing here is a map that I made a few years ago. So I'm from Washington, D.C. I was born and raised here, and I work here now at the Brookings Institution. I'm also on the board of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, or WMATA, which is the tri-state authority that operates Metro Rail and Metro Bus, our regional transit system. So what I'm showing here is a map of the Metro Rail system that you can see includes a plethora of lines. And what I've done here is I've calculated a half-mile buffer around each station within the system. And then I looked at, I compiled a regional zoning map, which involved getting a lot of data from a lot of different jurisdictions. But I put this together and I basically simplified everyone's zoning code from many, many different categories into only 3 categories. One is open space or agricultural reserve. And on that map, this is shown in green. One is land that is zoned for detached single-family homes. And then that's shown in yellow on this map. And then I put all of the other zoning categories. So whether it's townhouses or industrial, office, retail, you name it, all the other zoning categories I put here in brown. So, what is really striking to me about this is that, as you can see, there is a huge amount of land in very close proximity to our Metro Rail stations that is reserved by zoning for the lowest intensity land uses possible. There are stations that don't have this problem, right? So there are stations where most of the stuff around the station is brown, right? But what I want to flag here is that there are also stations where most of the stuff is yellow. The one kind of caveat to all of this is that, as everyone on this webinar knows, I hope, just because land is zoned for something doesn't mean it's actually used for what it's zoned for. You can get a variance, or even in detached single family zones, for example, some institutional uses like schools are typically allowed by right. And so for example, in Arlington County, the station where National Airport is shown here as open space, but it's actually National Airport. So there's a few caveats to this map, but basically I did this analysis, and what I found is that, especially in Montgomery County, which is one of the neighboring jurisdictions to the District of Columbia and is served by Metro Rail's Red Line, I found that in the northwest quadrant of the District of Columbia and in Montgomery County, that a majority of the land around Metro Rail stations is reserved for detached single-family homes. and that most of it is actually used that way, with the exception of the Army Medical School. So, this is something that really motivates me to want to talk more about zoning, because Metro Rail is a multi-billion-dollar regional investment, multi-generational investment that everyone in the region pays for, but we are not maximizing the most efficient use of that enormous transformative investment when we reserve the land that has the greatest accessibility to that investment for these very, very low intensity land uses. So, this is something that keeps me up at night as a WMATA board member, and it's something that I think is a matter of efficiency, of equity, and it's something that it's of concern to everyone who lives in the DC region. And this is, I don't think, a unique dynamic to the DC area. I think that you will see this kind of dynamic really everywhere. And, this is something that I strongly believe needs to change. So let me see if I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
That's great. That's a great visual, Tracy. And it's, and all of this and all of the work that LOCUS does and SGA does, it's the land use transportation connection, throughout, that everybody's got to be aware of. So looking forward to your remarks in a few minutes. So if you could go off camera, and let's bring in Marcus King. Come on, camera. There you are. Hey, how are you? Marcus is the managing principal of Fabric Design in Detroit, Michigan. Kind of near and dear to my heart, Marcus. As people probably know ad nauseum on this call, I did my graduate work out in Ann Arbor, in Michigan, and we lots of tools there to go into the communities in Detroit, Woodbridge neighborhood, et cetera, and look at land use patterns and look at zoning. So near and dear to my heart is anything that's coming out of that urban laboratory in Detroit and applicable anywhere else in the country is great. So Marcus, give us an example that you've run across of how conventional zoning, conventional land use controls have resulted in intentional or unintentional inequities.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell a quick story of how some things are playing out here in Detroit, and as sort of an example, but I think also plays out in some other urban areas as well. I know for a fact play out in some other urban areas as well. But the phenomena I want to briefly talk about is the inequities that exist from a business standpoint, and who can start businesses, where they can start businesses. And that's important because that particularly here in Detroit, the city has this very entrepreneurial spirit. There's a lot of locals on the ground that are entrepreneurial in thought and in practice, and want to start businesses. But zoning provides a barrier, an obstacle for a lot of individuals within the city that do want to start businesses, primarily because the only places where you can start a lot of business are in these sort of hyper focused downtown-esque type areas, mainly in downtown and midtown. And that's fine, but it sort of alludes to this idea that zoning is sort of ingrained in our American way of thinking, in that a certain thing can only exist in one instance and as one type. So the example I would give you is that there were laws in our zoning code that not only prohibited certain uses from being in the neighborhoods, but there were also exuberant fines attached to some very rudimentary uses. So the example I'll give is this one lady. She wanted to start a hair salon in her neighborhood, and it was in a commercial space. It was in a commercial building, but that building was zoned was in a single family district. So the building existed before zoning here in Detroit. and it legally couldn't be allowed to be there. The city would like, the powers that be would like all of those sort of commercial uses to be in these sort of high profile areas. That presents a lot of economic barriers to a lot of individuals that live in Detroit, which the city has a very low area median income. And so the economic barrier to starting that business is not only locationally, but also economically, because there's all these other things that need to be satisfied in order to quote unquote play ball in where the city has sort of focused their commercial intentions, right? So you could imagine somebody that exists in a or that makes a decent living but has a income that's at the lower end of the spectrum, does not have the capital to pay for all the necessary permitting, pay for all the necessary improvements. Perhaps the building or the location needs to be cleaned up. Doesn't have all that sort of, and most importantly, and I'll talk a little bit about this in my slideshow, doesn't have the technical knowledge to operate this business within this sort of focused areas, right? And so the solution to that, and something that we're sort of negotiating here now, again, specifically within the neighborhoods, is looking at what building types used to exist in these neighborhoods before we had zoning, and use that as a marker to perhaps loosen some of those restrictions. But B, essentially, I talk a lot about this with my students, is allowing neighborhoods to grow organically, with some restrictions, of course, but allow the neighborhoods to grow organically so that somebody that does live in a neighborhood can support and satisfy some untapped needs in their neighborhood by providing that local small business, right? Like that hair salon, or like that corner store, or even a restaurant. It's one of the beautiful things that I love about DC, where I lived for about 8 years, is that you have this sort of kaleidoscope of different buildings, but they also have different uses. So you could live next to a single family row house. The next is the same building type, but it has a different use in it, right? It may have a restaurant. In fact, I was just in Adams Morgan, where you actually, you have that, was it Petworth rather, where you have that sort of different play of different uses that exist on the street, same building type, but the uses are diverse, right? So that's I'll leave it there, and I'll save the rest of the goodies for my presentation. But that's one inequity that sort of came to my mind.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. That's going to tie in great with our next speaker here, George Proakis. So George, if you can come on board here. Speaking of urban laboratories in Somerville, George, very familiar face here in Massachusetts, very familiar voice in zoning matters across the state. George is the executive director of the, let me get this right, the Mayor's Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development in Somerville, one of the densest cities in America, actually. And George has been at the helm there for quite a while, and I'm sure has plenty of examples of cheek by jowl inequities in zoning. So George, give us a couple minutes on that, and then we'll get Tracy started on the presentations.
Sure, and if you wouldn't mind humoring me so I can share a single page of my screen as well. What I want to share is a page of a report we did on Somerville's old zoning prior to the point where we did the zoning overhaul that was passed in 2019. And if I can just put that one page up for a moment, it would just allow me to, let's see, I think that's going to work. Yes, okay. So what you see here is from a study we did of our zoning districts prior to the zoning overhaul to try to outline some of the challenges we had. This is a boundary of the city of Somerville. The gray area, which is, I think, more than half, definitely, probably 70% of the land area in the city at the time, is our Residence A and Residence B zoning. A lot of people gave the city a lot of credit because we don't have single family zoning. We haven't had single family zoning before. These are 2-family and 3-family zoning districts, and people go, isn't that great? Somerville has 2- and 3-family zoning districts. And I will say our intent was not to radically change these districts, but to consider the idea of allowing a backyard cottage, or can a large single family add a second unit, or even more basic than that, can a growing family add a dormer to be able to add an extra bedroom when they have a baby? What this map shows is lot conformance between the zoning and the lots. The dark shaded lots, all 23 of them, you can count them right there, all 23 lots. Those are the 23 conforming lots in the city of Somerville where you don't need to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals to modify your existing building because of it being a pre-existing non-conforming structure. So to be clear, unless you are in one of those 23 lots, most of the time, if you wanted to add a dormer or definitely add a unit, or add a little backyard home addition or something like that, you typically found that you were taking a trip to Somerville Zoning Board of Appeals for permission to do that because you had a non-conforming lot. Now, a lot of this was actually by design. I mean, the general strategy here was that the way we got design review and the way we made sure people built contextual activity, contextual space around them, was that the best way that we could do that was to actually get ourselves into a situation where if everything is non-conforming, well, then that will make sure that everything goes to the board and gets reviewed. But the impact on a family, on a homeowner, the impact on somebody renting and seeking a unit when there isn't really access to units because there isn't enough flexibility to deal with the pressure in the market on these particular things. This particular item, I didn't think much of it when we put this map in our report. What I found most amusing was it turned out as a part of our larger conversation on zoning overhaul that this map became really important because it took off on social media, something I never anticipated happening, and became a very popular conversation of Somerville, the non-conforming city, that allowed us to have more conversations about where to go with zoning in the future. So that's my short story, and I look forward to presenting more in a bit.
That I've never seen. I missed the social media piece on that, George. That is an amazing graphic, and I think goes to the root of, what we're going to talk about today. And God bless your volunteer boards who are administering all of those permits and approvals. That's an enormous amount of time, I'm sure, in those processes. So, all right, let's get started. Tracy, hello again. How are you?
I'm back.
All right, let's kick us off. And I do want to remind everybody, if you have questions, Marta has put in the chat there, put your questions in that box, and we'll try to get to them either at the end of these presentations, or we'll throw them in at the end when all the panelists come on board for their Q&A session. So let's get started with Tracy. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Doug. All right, I'm gonna just walk you guys through some of the kind of the national picture and context for why now is a really interesting time to be talking about zoning. So I work at the Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metro. And what transformative placemaking is all about is a hyper-local focus with Metro's same original kind of regional impact. And so we focus on kind of sub-regional dynamics, the policies and practices that shape neighborhoods and sub-regional jurisdictions like cities and counties. And transformative placemaking for us is really about, looking at the current state of practice and realizing that we all need a new approach that breaks down silos between economic development, land use planning, traditional placemaking, and community development. And that we need to start getting more precise about which kinds of policies and practices work best at which scale, and how to make a difference, not just on our street, but in our whole neighborhood. And that is about creating holistic solutions that pull from the best insights of different disciplines in order to to create something that is truly transformative. So our framework for transformative placemaking is an outcomes-based framework that is not just about a theory, but is about a practice that is specifically oriented at delivering these outcomes. And I'm not going to read you guys through all of these, but basically the big picture here is that you know, this is not just about everything in the kitchen sink and making anything possible. This is about a specific vision for what would make places stronger and more inclusive and more sustainable. Today, we're going to talk specifically about the built environment and how we regulate it. And I'm specifically wanting to focus on how zoning leads to different outcomes in terms of flexibility, accessibility, and sustainability, because not all zoning codes are created equal. And we're all making choices every day about these outcomes and what we want to see in our communities. And transformative placemaking is about this specific vision of a built environment that is flexible, accessible, and sustainable. Okay, so that's how we talked about transformative placemaking before 2020. But then 2020 happened. And this is what was in the window of J. Crew in the summer of 2020. The future is looking bright. J. Crew declared bankruptcy while this window display was still up. And what else happened in 2020? Well, you know, it was a lot. I'm going to walk you through a few things here. So the first is that the coronavirus pandemic began to shift demand across real estate products. And we're now realizing that clearly a lot of those shifts are going to be long-term, that they're not temporary. And then the resulting economic downturn really started hurting people, including players at all levels in the real estate ecosystem, you know, who are working on different aspects of the built environment. We got a wake-up call that white supremacy is alive and well in the United States, and that land use segregation is part of what's keeping it alive and well. And then we also got a wake-up call that where and how we grow is making climate change worse and circling back around to bite us in the butt as climate change related disasters escalate in cost and impact to the built environment. But, you know, this convergence is horrible, but it's also an opportunity to reset and reimagine. We need to recognize the need to create more walkable, transit-oriented, mixed-income communities for people. We need to recognize the benefits of creating those kinds of communities for people and places. And we need to start talking about the role of real estate in creating these more connected, inclusive, and vibrant communities. And that's why I want to talk about zoning now more than ever. Because right now, we're building the wrong things in the wrong places for the wrong people. We are in this three-sided paradox where there's more demand than ever, but the buildings and places we have don't match the rapidly changing business models, demographics, and climate pressures that we're facing. So it's a somewhat crazy situation that presents both an imperative and an opportunity for local policymakers and for real estate practitioners to work together to create a built environment that works better for more people, businesses, and communities. I'm excited about doing that. So right now I'm going to show you a little bit of my research that I did with my friends here at Smart Growth America last year. I'm going to walk you through 4 key trends that have these major implications for the future of how we live, work, and shop. And I'm mostly going to be showing you pre-COVID data, but the bottom line is actually all of the trends that I'm showing have really been accelerated by the pandemic, not you know, inverted or changed. Okay, let's start by talking about persistent residential racial and land use segregation. So in the US, the spatial scale of segregation has gradually increased over time. You know, this is a segregated country. It is right now, and it always has been. Segregation's been pretty stable, you know, like some you know, minor improvement, but mostly it's been pretty stable. And what's changed about it is the spatial scale of it. So as the population has shifted from city to suburb, what we're now seeing is that mostly white people and people of color do not live in the same neighborhoods. But now it's not just neighborhoods, it's entire jurisdictions. And jurisdictional boundaries are becoming a new kind of formal way to enforce and police and leverage segregation to create inequality. And let's take a little look at what's going on with demographic change and how our living patterns are changing. So what I'm showing on this graph here is the household formation patterns of Americans aged 23 to 38 as of 2019. This is what's more commonly called the millennial generation. And this generation is not forming the same household arrangements as their predecessors. So if we take that age bracket, 23 to 38, and we walk it back in history, we can see that in 1968, 23 to 38-year-olds, most of them, the vast majority of them, were married and had at least one child. But today, that's less than 30% of them. So even as being married with children has really declined as a household type, all other kinds of household arrangements are increasing, whether it's no spouse, no child, a spouse but no children, or children but no spouse. There's all kinds of new arrangements, group houses, roommates. All of these arrangements are becoming more common. And what that means is that we have a mismatch between the kinds of households that we're forming and our housing inventory, because even as this drastic shift in households and average household size has happened, our housing supply has remained stagnant. And in fact, the only housing category that has grown as a share of national inventory over time during the time period when this shift was happening is houses with 4+ bedrooms. So, this kind of mismatch might be why there's this like surge in intergenerational living and living with roommates, because it's households that might otherwise, that are smaller and might prefer to consume smaller units. They're trying to pretzel themselves into the inventory that's actually available. And, the issues that we're facing in the built environment are not just about housing, especially with the pandemic, we're seeing, now in real time that the nature of office work is changing. So prior to the pandemic, what we found at Brookings is that the information sector in particular was really demanding extremely high density and proximity, that tech companies want to locate not just in the same region, but that they want to locate in the same neighborhood, or maybe even on the same block, or even in the same building. So these really, really hyper-local demands for density and proximity. So that's what we found before the pandemic. Now we see that the pandemic has made telework the norm for many workers. And, there's a lot of different estimates here. The most recent American Community Survey has about 15% of Americans with telework as their typical work structure as of 2021. Okay, so the bottom line is that both of those trends, increased telework and increased demand for intense proximity, both of those things actually result in the same outcome, which is that the median amount of office square feet per worker has been in major decline for a long time now. And this trend will continue. That, the way that you can squeeze more workers into a very small amount of space is by allocating fewer square feet per worker. And then that's also a sensible thing to do. Especially as we move from 100% telework to a potential hybrid model. where workers are in the office less. The only thing that's really reasonable is to decrease office consumption. Okay, and at the same time, we're seeing both, before and during the pandemic, that retail business models are changing really dramatically. So there's way too much retail in terms of building square footage in the United States at this point. But the weird paradox is that the places that have the biggest glut of retail, somehow it's still in the wrong place. So we see a really clear trend here where regions that have way too much retail per capita, somehow they also have the lowest neighborhood retail accessibility. So this is really a double problem that I'm showing on this graph for the regions that are kind of toward the right here. And this is particularly alarming because this isn't what the market is demanding, right? What we actually see is that there's a huge demand for walkable neighborhood retail, that it commands major rent premiums. This is not just in New York. We found this across the top 30 MSAs in the United States. Okay, so this is New York all the way down to Cleveland. And so there's a real mismatch here between, what's demanded and what the market is able to provide. And, that mismatch is especially dramatic in Black and brown neighborhoods, where regardless of income, what we find across all income strata is that Black neighborhoods are systematically underserved by retail relative to neighborhoods where the share of the population, the share of the Black population is lower. So this is just an enormous market opportunity that's being missed right now. And what is going on in retail real estate that that a mismatch this dramatic can be happening? This is the question that I have. So today we're talking about today I'm going to also preview some research about how zoning reform could affect residential demographics, but in the slide that I just showed previously, this is also a zoning issue, right? Regarding whether the kind of mixing of uses that Marcus was talking about, is allowed everywhere. Okay, so I specifically now want to preview a little bit more research about why we need to legalize more diverse housing. And this is unpublished research that I'm just kind of giving you guys a sneak peek at today. So bear with me because I'm sharing these results for the first time and still kind of feeling out what I have here. Okay, so I did a national analysis of every census tract in the United States to look at neighborhoods where single family homes are the dominant item in the housing inventory and to compare those to other neighborhoods. And I have a few interesting findings from that. So the first is that there are many single family homes even in urban neighborhoods. So how I defined urban here is these are actual incorporated cities. These are the principal cities of each MSA in the United States. And I found that, while a majority of census tracts in cities are less than half single family homes, which is like what you might expect in the city, I also found that almost half, 47% of neighborhoods in cities have single family homes as a majority, and detached single family homes. This is not row houses, these are detached, as a majority of their inventory. So the point I'm trying to make here is this is not something that is just a suburban issue. This is something that's of concern in every city in the United States, including all of our major cities. So for example, what I'm showing here is pictures of San Jose. And you can see here that, San Jose, super high growth area where there's a ton of demand, but, the vast majority of San Jose is zoned for single family homes. So this is a swing and a miss. I also found that neighborhoods that have less diverse housing inventory tend to be less racially diverse. So, this may seem extremely obvious, but I thought it was necessary to crunch the numbers. And so what I'm showing here is that we can see that when a tract's share of single family housing is less than 50%, so that means that half of the housing in that tract is something else, townhouses, apartments, whatever. So when you get single family housing down to the point where it's not the dominant kind of housing that's available in that tract, these neighborhoods are very diverse. These are the most racially diverse kinds of neighborhoods in the United States. And the more single family housing dominates the housing inventory mix in a neighborhood, the less diverse the neighborhood becomes. So there's a connection here between detached single family housing and integration that I think communities really need to interrogate. In particular, whiteness and single family housing have become uniquely connected. And, there's a lot of history, that has led up to this. But what I'm showing on this graph is that, we can see here clearly that if we look at the distribution of the relationship between neighborhoods where white people are the majority ethnic group, and neighborhoods where, other ethnic groups are the majority, we can see that white neighborhoods, almost by definition, are majority single family housing neighborhoods. And that definition is more flexible for most other racial groups. So what we see on this graph is there are majority Black neighborhoods that are mostly single family housing, right? That is also true, and that's okay. But there are majority Black neighborhoods that have far more diverse housing inventory as well, and that's not true for majority white neighborhoods. So, this kind of, singular connection is why, there are advocates that feel that detached single family housing, has almost become like racially coded in a way, because I find it a little uncomfortable to look at this graph and see that, the reality is that almost all majority white neighborhoods have the same urban form. So, this question of diversity, I think, also needs to be applied to income. And this finding was extremely surprising for me, which is that, actually across the board, neighborhoods are really diverse. Our neighborhood really are really diverse in terms of income. So we can see here that if I can use the phrase income segregation, that income segregation in the United States is way less bad is way less extreme than racial segregation, right? So that's why these scores across the board are a lot closer to 1, right? So 1 would be like, sort of totally mixed. So we can see that the issue is actually not that, having less diverse housing inventory means that, like, people of a particular income cannot afford to live in a particular neighborhood. mostly neighborhoods are mixed in terms of income, like, because people figure out how to do things like share, single family houses, for example. So, this I think kind of complicates the conversation about what it is about urban form in terms of housing inventory, that is either is it either a symptom or a cause of racial segregation, but it's not being driven by income, because the bottom line is actually like most Black people aren't poor, and so that's not what's preventing people from living in different neighborhoods. And so my current hypothesis as I look at this is that, like, when your housing inventory is less diverse, that also probably means like overall inventory is lower, and that inventory turnover is lower. And so it's just when a neighborhood is majority detached single family housing, it's just harder to even have an opportunity for a new family to enter that neighborhood. Neighborhood change is just less when the housing stock is just detached single family homes. So that's my current hypothesis here, and I'm still noodling on this. But so those are kind of my early findings here, and I'm really looking forward to discussing them with y'all. I'd love to hear folks' reactions and hypotheses about why I might be finding this stuff.
Tracy, great stuff. How is this research going to get rolled out, and when? I know you're in the middle of it here. What's going to be the platform to push this out from Brookings?
So I'll be publishing this as a research brief. So the first kind of set of stuff that I showed about those 4 trends, that's already published. Brookings published that jointly with Smart Growth America last December. It's a research report called The Great Real Estate Reset that's super easy to find online and free, accessible to the public. This is not behind any kind of paywall. It's not in a journal that you don't have a subscription to. That's on the internet and everyone can get it. This new stuff that I'm playing with about housing inventory, I will publish in January as a research brief on brookings.edu. I am still trying to wrap my head around the income finding in particular was really surprising to me, that like more diverse housing inventory it doesn't mean that your neighborhood's going to be more income diverse, because pretty much all neighborhoods are income diverse. I was like, that's really interesting, how different the race and the income findings are. And I'm still tooling with how to interpret that. And what I think the implications are, but I will kind of noodle on that over the holidays, and I'll be publishing these findings in a brief in January that will also be free and available to the public.
If I could put you on the spot, maybe the attendee list is available here through the registrations. Maybe you can push that out directly to some of the folks, or the attendee list. I know the emails are all there if you want to do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to email this to everyone, and I will keep this like a short piece, because this isn't something that I'm like, oh, I have all the answers, So like this will be a quick read. Like the idea is like less than 4,000 words, but basically to just get at this idea that like there's something going on here with housing inventory and race that is uncomfortable and is not driven by income, which is like something you hear a lot. when people talk about like changing the housing inventory mix, is you hear just like, oh well, like anyone can live in this neighborhood if they can afford it, and that's actually like not what's going on.
Right. Good. All right. Well, thank you. Very provocative. I'm sure we'll get into more of the Q&A on that. So thank you. Okay. Next up, we have Marcus King. Come on camera, please.
You got it.
All right. Again, this is just a fascinating presentation that we're going to hear from Marcus in a minute about equity and quality and disparate impacts, particularly in Atlanta, some of the research that he's done. So Marcus, go ahead, take it away.
All right. Perfect. Oops, I lost it. All right, there we go. Okay, so listening to Tracy's presentation it's kind of eerie how some of the things that I'm going to be talking about really depart where she's beginning to talk about as well. It's really amazing to see. So a couple of disclaimers. You know, I am an architect, but I also work in urban design and development, but I'm also an educator, and a lot of the information that I'll be showing you is a hodgepodge of work that I've been doing on my own professionally, but also work that and some trends that some of my students are finding here. And I'm talking while I'm setting myself a timer just so I don't go over my 20 minutes. So yeah, that's what I'll be presenting to you today in short form, as well as some other some ideas for some other topics and talks that I've done that sort of relate to this issue. So I think in our common social dialogue, there's this mismatch and there's this misinterpretation of the ideas of equity and equality. And I'm taking this directly from my class, or how I start my class. The definition of equity in its simplest form is this idea of fairness and justice, the way people are treated. This is different from equality, primarily because equity, being equal, is mentioned in our founding documents as an American society, right? All men are created equal. We've heard that maxim a lot of times, right? And so this is, in some respects, this idea of equity or equality, equity, is founded in our documents. And I realized I had these mismatched. This is equality should be first and not equity. So sorry about that. So equality is a state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. And then we have equity, which is not sort of codified and protected within our founding documents as an American society. The difference here between the two is what social scientists like to call this idea of the disparate impact. And that means that all things being equal, there are still populations that are adversely affected by the seemingly harmless institution of a principle or a maxim of some sort, right? And so recognizing this idea of a disparate impact, it's up to society to choose to pursue equity. Equity exists where, or opportunities for equity exist where equality has fallen short because of disparate impacts. And so the example that I like to use is our built environment. As a built environmentalist myself, is this idea of a simple intersection, right? If all things being equal, or at a basic standpoint, the intersection works pretty simply, right? There's a right of way, and then there's private property that should define those, that should define the public realm. A lot of times doesn't, but that's a different discussion. And then within that public realm, there are means of traversing and moving about freely in the public space, right? And we've sort of detailed that a little bit to have cars here and have people over here, and that wasn't the case for the large part of our human history. And there's benefits to that. But so those things being equal, there are still populations that at that level can't use the public realm equitably, even though everything is equally dispersed or equally accessible, right? And we can see that we have populations that have disabilities, trouble seeing, trouble walking, people that have to care for other smaller humans, people that would desire to bike, people that have pets, right? And again, all things being equal, there are certain impediments that the quality presents to these populations that aren't addressed. And so that's why we have things like protective berms and street trees, clearly marked pedestrian walkways, bike paths, depressed street curbs that allow people that have trouble walking or seeing to equitably access the public realm of our cities, right? And so this is sort of a basic rudimentary example I can give you. This applies to zoning as well. And I'm a history buff. I love doing research on history. In modern zoning thought, I think it's erroneously said that the beginning of zoning in the American institution began with the New York Zoning Code of 1916, when it published its archetype zoning code that essentially gave us the critical skyscrapers that we know and love that dominate the New York skyline, mainly Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. But I argue that even before the 1916 zoning code, comprehensive zoning code of New York was put into play, there were a lot of different zoning codes that were being played around with before we got to that point. And these there weren't a lot of them. Zoning before the 1920s was essentially just this one-off passing of laws by different cities and municipalities. But the 6 major ones that sort of dominated the landscape and influenced the development of zoning are the ones that I'm showing on the screen now. And the particular comparison that I want to make here is that out of these 6 landmark sort of zoning experiments that were regulatory experiments that were happening before the 20th century, 4 out of 6 of them are related to either the use or the user. And that's very important, the use or the user, right? We're not just trying to regulate the form, right? In fact, only the ones in DC and Boston are strictly based on form, what we might call a form-based-esque code or alluding to that. But the rest of them have to do with either who uses the land, who has access to the land, and who the users are, right? And that's very important, because as zoning began to develop, this idea of use and user and regulating land based on uses and user became canon law, essentially, right? And so here is a couple of individuals who are key in forming the contemporary zoning code, or the stratagem and the framework of zoning code that we operate in America, even to this day. And they just so happen to all be proponents of segregation, proponents of some pretty vile language and some pretty vile perspectives as it relates to not just African Americans, but any person of color, as well as undesirable immigrants. And I use that language because that was at a time through New Deal policies, that was the exact language that was used by the HLLC and the FHA and the VA when determining what neighborhoods to give financial incentives to. And you might notice some familiar names up here. But again, these are people that are operating within the built environment and are on the sort of panels and committees that are shaping what would become the framework for American zoning in the 1930s when it was passed at the federal level from a recommendation standpoint, right? And so these thoughts are front and center at the idea of why we not only why we need zoning, but who we're going to zone out. It's much, you can sort of see it from these quotations, right? Form is rarely, if at all, mentioned by these individuals who are forming the American zoning code. It's always about the uses and or the users, right? And that became, that essentially became law. And so what I want to show here is a couple of images that some of my students done in comparing and contrasting different decades, but also different ideas that have relations to one another. So on the left is the Atlanta 1922 tentative zoning map. Tentative because this is not the one that was passed. There's a slight difference, and I'll allude to that later. And on the right is about 10, 15 years later, what would be Atlanta's 1935 HLLC residential security map, or colloquially called the Redlining Map. And we find striking similarities between the two. So if you take, actually, let me back up a little bit for those that can't read the tiny captions at the bottom. So on the left, the purple is a R1, what was called in the code white district, and then the R2 district might sound familiar. R2 district is the colored district, and then the R3 is essentially an undefined race district. Essentially, this will become the expansion of the R2 colored districts. So what we see, if we start to overlap the two, are some striking findings. So if we just take the colored districts, what was called the colored districts in the Atlanta zoning code, we can see they fall right in the middle of redlined areas, right? There's a direct correlation between where African Americans and immigrants, undesirable immigrants, can live through a zoning law in the redlined areas, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we see the R1 white only districts and exactly where they fall. There's some slight overlap in the redlined areas. That's primarily because those were they didn't end up becoming R1 districts, they became more industrial. But we see the periphery of the city falls into non-redlined districts, right? And for those of you that know anything about the HLLC maps and the redlining maps, essentially what this is saying is that from a federal government standpoint, we are not going to give any government subsidies, any direct equity mortgages, any 15, 30-year mortgages, any competitive interest rates in the redlined areas, i.e. where Black folks live, or where immigrants and other quote unquote undesirables live, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we're going to favor and give favorable terms in terms of financing those neighborhoods to those that live in the R1 district, quote unquote, where white Americans live, right? And here, and you can, I'm showing this as one example, but my students, they do a case study every year of individual cities. This phenomena plays out in nearly every city where you have zoning and where you have an HLLC map or redlining map at the beginnings of the just past century, right, the 20th century. I'm showing this because it alludes to the rampant propagation of the single-family zone in our American society. So here in these maps, this is a series that I think was in the New York Times or Washington Post, I can't remember. But pink here represents single-family housing, and blue represents everything else, right? And so if we recognize there's a relationship between R1 or single-family zoning and the financing structures, who is able to build equity, who is able to own and manipulate and build wealth in America, we can then deduct from maps that look like this that, okay, if we're saying that everything has to be single family homes, we're essentially saying that because of this connection, this historical connection between African Americans and their relationship with single family zoning, we are saying that there are certain individuals within the American context that can and cannot not just own property, but build wealth from that property. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. In departing from that, we also have this phenomena of running our public infrastructure through those areas as well. So this is a series of diagrams that one of my students did showing the connection between African Americans and redlined areas, but also that being a stratagem for how we ran public infrastructure through our cities. This is in my home city of Detroit. And we can see the direct correlation between where African Americans could own land, the one area they could own and build wealth, and how that was completely destroyed by public infrastructure in the name of urban renewal. So again, even though the tentative plan for Atlanta zoning did not pass the Supreme Court test, what you will find, and even from some of those quotes that I mentioned, is that people began getting creative about how they racially zone out certain demographics, right? You couldn't specifically mention white race or colored district or white district, right? And so the only change that happened to that tentative Atlanta zoning ordinance and plan and map was the mention of race, right? All the other mechanisms that apply to those districts stayed the same, right? And that's critical, right? Because it was unconstitutional to mention race or to specifically mention race as a means to separate individuals, as well as dispose or procure property. By removing the mention of race, and from some of the quotations you can that I presented, you can still attach different regulatory and economic mechanisms that would essentially get you the same thing as if you did mention race. And that is the sort of the secret diabolical intent of our original zoning structure. And to kind of put a pin in that, this idea, a lot of people conflate this idea of ownership with wealth, right? And they're two totally different things. So, you know, I'm showing a map of from the Census Bureau that shows home ownership levels before redlining maps were created, and then just after when those redlining maps were defunct and deemed unconstitutional. And we see a strike rise in ownership based along all demographics, which is good, right? It's still traditionally and even to this day 20% lower than white Americans, but there's an increase, right? But here's what you really have to look at, right? Even though the ownership in that same period of time sort of increased, we see that the wealth that exists between white Americans and non-white or Black and Hispanic Americans is strikingly separate and different, right? So again, even though ownership is increasing, the wealth that is able to be built from that ownership is by a factor of 10 or more, right? Between white Americans and Black Americans and other person of color Americans as well, right? And this is a direct byproduct of our zoning and the economic mechanisms that we've attached to that zoning. So Kevin is appalled, and so am I. All right, and so what we've done is we've created a landscape and a system that regulates land and what the land can be used for, who can occupy or use the land, and who has access to the land. And as a byproduct, we've created all these environments, by and large, across the American landscape that are, from a formal standpoint, segregated and disjointed and sprawling. They lack a lot of spatial form. We value the land uses and not the productivity of that land, which I think is a grave mishap. They're focused on our machines and our tech, mainly our cars. And they're this idea, what I call placeless and time sensitive, meaning that they only exist and they're only relevant to the time that they exist in now, because they aren't diverse and because they have these one-trick ponies, mainly single-family houses, or in the opposite end of the spectrum, really large apartment buildings or condo buildings that don't allow the city to adapt over time. And for the purposes of this conversation, they provide zoning, whether intentionally or unintentionally or unrecognizably today, provide a disparate impact on people of color, immigrants, and low-income families, even today in the 21st century. What that has left us with in our landscape, however, even though we don't have the racial implications that zoning was born out of today, there's still a very terse impact that zoning has on our impacts. We either have one or the other, right? You have what we see in a lot of, especially small town downtowns, is that they're ghost towns, and primarily because we've zoned ourselves out of these really diverse and vibrant downtowns. At the other end of the spectrum, we've zoned ourselves out of having real complete neighborhoods, meaning neighborhoods that do more than one thing, right? You have to drive to go do your other daily task, right? That may be fine for some people, but for the large swaths of Americans that can't afford cars, I can tell you that's the case here in Detroit. That provides, again, a disparate impact on those populations, right? Because of the zoning and the way we structure our neighborhoods. So similar to what Tracy was talking about, we have to take into consideration the untraditional American families that we have today. And I say untraditional because a lot of our framework, our physical framework, was built on the idea of a nuclear family, mainly a husband and wife and a child, primarily of white nature, right? But today we have so many different types of American family types, right? Many of which I'm showing you on the screen now, right? And so if we provide different types of housing types, and not only housing types, but commercial types as well, as we're seeing in the landscape because of the pandemic, we provide diverse types in general, we can provide more of what the market itself is demanding out of us as a built environment, right? This is a diagram that I drew to bring that point to the forefront, right? When you provide these diverse different types, you allow different people, different families that are at different points in their lives to have a place, an economically affordable and sustainable place to live and exist in the built environment, right? It will be very difficult for a large extended family, or excuse me, a disabled veteran that needs a caretaker to exist in a single family house, right? For a variety of different practical reasons, right? And at the same time, you know, it may not be for small format single family houses may not be conducive to a large extended family. You may need a single family house, but maybe that the older part of that generational family wants to still have some privacy, right? And so maybe an ADU off the back is the solution, right? But you have to be able to provide that so you get again, you can provide diverse solutions for a diverse market. And you know, I don't have to tell you about some of the pandemic things that we've been forced to realize now as people begin to teach from home, nurse from home, work from home. I myself work from home as well and entertain clients from home as well. But again, a lot of our zoning codes on the boards today don't allow for this diverse interpretations of what the home needs or means, right? And I showed these examples. These are houses that had shops in some form or another that exist in the Detroit landscape. And I have hundreds of these. And I like showing these because it speaks to a time before zoning here in Detroit in the 40s, where you could mix and adapt your house to do more diverse things, right? And so you have a shop in front of a house. You had a family that stayed in the back, but they also owned and operate a shop in the front. Maybe that was an office, maybe it was an ice cream shop, you know, maybe it was a shop. But again, the point here is that you're allowing the house to be other things as the family and the market demand, and not regulating people out of what they need their homes to be. And I'm going to skip that because I want to get to this, and I know my time is coming to an end here. So we'll end with these few slides here. In general, zoning codes need to be able to put the cookies where kids can reach them. I like to use this little example here, right? Make it easier to do cool stuff. Make it easier to do stuff that the market wants to do, right? So and what the market is demanding the supply be, right? And so here's 6 things that I think zoning, by and large, again, this takes different forms in different municipalities, but by and large, these are 6 things that I think cities across the spectrum need to rethink. Form needs to be held in higher regard than use, right? Again, we sort of carry forward this tradition of zoning by use, and again, that has very, very strong racial foundations, whether you know it or not, in our city, right? We've zoned based on use and users instead of zoning based on form, which helps to create the public realm that we want, and then allowing the uses to be flexible within reason again, so that you can adapt over time. And that's the problem with a lot of cities, that they can't adapt over time because they're zoning based on use and as a byproduct the users. A different interpretation of the house, or that's my third point. A house is greater than single family zoning, right? A lot of people that in my position that advocate for other things other than single family houses think that people are trying to zone out single family houses in general, and we're not. I myself am not in opposition to single family houses. What I am in opposition to is single family zoning only, right? So you can build a single family house, but somebody that wants to do something a little bit more diverse from a building type standpoint should be able to do something else. And that leads me to my third point, is that traditionally, before zoning, the idea of a house had much more diverse interpretations. Even our current federal FHA and VA system even identifies this or acknowledges this, right? Acknowledges this. To get a traditional 15, 20, or 30-year mortgage from the VA or the FHA, you can build a house, which is anything that is 4 units or less, or has commercial uses that are 50% or less of the entire building footprint, right? So even the financial mechanisms of our federal government recognize that a house can be other things than a single family use building entity. And then parking, releasing some of the parking restrictions, or the parking requirements, I should say, that a lot of cities impose as a means to allow our parcels to operate more efficiently. And then the last two things allude to things that cities can do to empower people, and that's governmental support. The city of South Bend does a really good job of this, providing government support and technical assistance for people that have been traditionally excluded out of the development process, and providing technical assistance so that they know how to walk through the entitlement process and the permit process and get their projects built. And then empower locals. So I myself am a teacher of development. I'm a member of the Incremental Development Alliance, and we teach locals how to do small scale neighborhood projects in their neighborhood. We also work with municipalities to show them how they can release some of the obstacles and restrictions on their zoning code so that these locals can do jobs within their neighborhoods. And so in here, so just as we have different tools and sizes of tools to do certain jobs from a technical standpoint, you have this is a ratchet set. So we have different size ratchets, different ratchet bits that help us do different types of jobs. We also need to allow our built environment to operate just like that ratchet set, different sizes, different types, so that we can do different jobs or provide different housing options and housing choices for the diverse families and the diverse tasks that we need to solve in our built environment today. So with that, I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Marcus. Interesting. When you talk about race-only requirements in zoning, this is sort of coming from one of the questions that's been posed here. What about income only? For example, making the market meet the supply, renting single-family homes, right? So not necessarily the ownership paradigm, but rental. Have you seen any in your research or anecdotes about that introduction of rental single-family housing in the market? How has that played into any disparities, among housing choice, whether it's not necessarily race, but income and economics? How is that research?
That's a good question. I think it's funny. Tracy showed that diagram about the mismatch, and I think that mismatch again exists as a blanket sort of 10,000 foot issue that the country has to deal with. But I think again it has that disparate impact on populations of lower incomes in general, and in our context that just so happens to be those that are people of color, right? And so, one of the things that we're finding here in Detroit, as most of our city is zoned single family, about 70%, I think, you're forcing these individuals that have lower incomes to live in a house that they can't maintain, not because they don't want to, because they don't have the economics to. But again, that's all the supply is giving, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I operate within the development teaching mechanism that I do, is because the city has here in Detroit, I'll speak from the Detroit perspective, the city has a lot of initiatives that are trying to provide funding for smaller scale neighborhood projects. And They just don't have the technical know-how to get those projects off the board. In addition to that, there's a lot of African-American developers here in the city that again want to do these smaller projects, but more diverse projects. So, I have a couple of friends that do own a triplex, and they own it specifically for the purpose that they want to rent out the other two to provide affordable housing in their neighborhood. All right, they live in the neighborhood. They want to be good stewards of the neighborhood. They also recognize that everybody in their neighborhood can't afford a single family house, but they still deserve a place to live, right? And so I like to sort of summarize it in this idea of just, figuring out what your farm is. A lot of us come from certain places that we love, and you sort of farm that area by providing or being able to provide what that neighborhood needs, right? So people like myself or like my friend who have more means than other people that live in our community, and we want to farm this area so that we can provide housing choice for people that live in our neighborhood, but it also benefits the local economic area as well too, because again, you're providing a means of income for those that own property within the area, as opposed to, again, a single family house where you wouldn't be able to do that. It can just be that single family house and you transfer that property. Again, the market for large single family houses in Detroit is not great. So again, that just kind of alludes to the whole mismatch, right? But I do think that mismatch does disproportionately affect people of color, and indeed just lower income individuals at large.
Great. Well, let's probe that with Tracy when we do the group Q&A. So thank you, Marcus.
Yeah.
Great. All right, let's bring on George next.
Hello.
Hello. How are you, George? All
Good.
right.
How are you?
Good. Good. So the Massachusetts perspective here in Somerville. Let's get rolling. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to provide some perspective from Somerville on the issues regarding equity in zoning, some lessons, some insight, and hopefully some things that are transferable. I know sometimes people speak of Somerville as being somewhat unique because we're so dense, but I do think there are lessons to draw on any size or shape of community when you look at the Somerville circumstance. I do want to say that a lot of this perspective comes from looking at the inner core of Boston, although certainly, as I said, things are transferable into even the far corners of communities. But one of our challenges in the inner core, where the Metro Mayors Coalition is co-chaired by Mayor Curtatone, my boss, is that sale prices and rents are amongst the highest of any large metropolitan area. So there is a significant challenge in a place where they've added 110,000 residents and 148,000 jobs and only 32,000 housing units over the course of the last decade. So Metro Mayors Coalition believes we need 185,000 housing units by 2030 in order to meet demand and reduce the challenges that we face. And that's within those inner core communities. There's housing demand and challenges beyond that as well. But I want to think about how we put those in the perspective of equity and land use regulations. I think first it's important to understand the historical challenges that zoning faces, and I think our previous speakers have done a very good job of addressing those circumstances. I think we have to consider certain strategies that we can put into zoning that I believe work at any community size and circumstance when they're appropriate. And I want to run through 6 using Somerville's examples as we go here today. And I think, as I said, you need to calibrate those to the local context. So I'm going to do my best to try to do that as I present Somerville. So starting out with, in Somerville, we did a zoning overhaul. We did a citywide, top to bottom, rewrote zoning overhaul. And I think one of the reasons you can see why is the answer to my earlier question, where we had such a mismatch with nonconformity. This isn't for everybody, but I do believe that the toolkit for the overhaul can be broken apart and looked at to maybe work for communities, even if you're not doing a full zoning overhaul. And hopefully, if you do, it doesn't take you 7 years like ours did. But the new code is really interesting because it is a form-based code. It is calibrated for Somerville, a form-based code, but we did stick with form as our underlying strategy to help us in this circumstance in our community. So I talk about zoning and the challenges of zoning. I like to look at Euclid, Ohio. I know Mark's talked about New York and kind of some of the earlier concepts of land use regulation in the community. Euclid is unique because it is the circumstance where the overall concept of setbacks and zones and districts and uses was first tested at the Supreme Court when the Ambler Realty Company said they didn't like being in a certain zone in Euclid. In the 1926 U.S. Supreme Court determined that zoning was legal and that, as they said, it's best to keep the pig in the barnyard and not in the parlor. I think for the most part, when they were referring to pigs, they were referring to multifamily housing and industrial uses. This is Euclid zoning ordinance today, and you can this is successful at divided zoning. This is Euclid, Ohio. You have your single families, your single family district. You have your pod of multifamily. You have your retail. If you live in a house over in the single family and you want to get to the retail, there's no good way to do that because there's a big fence in between them. And that certainly is the strategy and the idea of the way single-use zoning was created. Form follows regulation. Architects will tell you form follows function, but when you try to create New England communities and form follows regulation and you require parking and you require all these other setbacks and everything else, you might get the cupola that was on your New England town hall, but what you get it in is a strip mall. So conventional zoning has its challenges. It regulates development within zones. What setbacks really do is they identify where you can't build. They establish long lists of uses often, and then they build upon that an administrative program that usually, particularly in our state, includes a lot of design review, site plan review, discretionary permits, et cetera. But it's difficult to understand what zoning will do and what change will do. And it becomes even more difficult when you come to government and you say, I want to change zoning. I like to say that in many of our communities in Massachusetts where you have to go to town meeting for a zoning change, the two scariest words to a town meeting are change and zoning, and you put change and zoning together and try to explain what you want to do and it becomes very challenging. What you end up relying on a lot is the special permit is well, we don't know if this should happen or shouldn't happen, but what we'll do is we'll let the planning board sort it out case by case or the zoning board of appeals sort it out case by case. And that becomes really challenging. So here are 4 kind of challenges of zoning. Setbacks, as I said, where you can't build. These buildings have the same setbacks. And, from a kind of contextual standpoint, this sixplex doesn't really fit, even though having 6 units here might actually work. Floor area ratio, which was designed for high rises in New York and now we use in single family districts. Floor area ratio is like handing someone a box of Play-Doh and saying, okay, you can have this much Play-Doh for this particular circumstance. But the problem with Play-Doh is you can make a house with Play-Doh, but you can make a dinosaur with Play-Doh. You can form that floor area ratio into something that is or isn't contextual. Open space, okay, we'll require a percentage of open space and we'll get our nice little New England town green here, but sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way. Developers just sort of count the square footage to see what drainage ditch they need to count as open space. And regulation of uses. My favorite thing to lean on in terms of a conventional zoning code is, oh, don't worry about it. We'll build a business district and we'll make it really flexible. So for the example, let me take one business district that had 180 uses or something, or I think over 200 actually in California, and they listed the things that they want to allow in this district. Now you want to open a small business in this district. You're a person starting out who has a chance to potentially add something to this community, and you go to a district with a zoning code like this, and you're looking at this list, number 19, baths, Turkish, number 25, boxing arena. No, that's not going to work. Chinchilla retail sales, you cannot wholesale sell a chinchilla in this district. That means charitable institutions, but why use a small word when a big one will do? Embalming business, well, I guess that's one option for something you can do. Physical culture institution. This comes with no definitions, by the way, so if anyone can tell me what 95 means, if you want to put that in the chat, I'd really like to know. I've been doing this presentation for many years and I still haven't figured it out. 109, you can manufacture a potato chip, but if your potato chip company turns out to also want to do corn chips, well, you have to go back and amend the zoning to add corn chip manufacturing to your list, apparently. Number 127, tombstones, you can do your tombstones and your embalming in this district. And these folks, for reasons that to this day I still do not understand, really liked their Turkish baths because it was also number 135 on the list. So you get to a system like that and you do that and you say, okay, well, maybe we'll allow this and maybe we'll allow that. And as I said, people then sort of lean on discretion as the solution to this challenge. So it's like, well, we don't know if we want that or not want that, but maybe we do, and we definitely want to do design review. So we'll make it a special permit, and we'll put findings they have to meet. This is typical special permit findings, but the language is so wishy-washy that nobody really knows what you can or can't do, and then everybody gets suspicious of it. So every time there's a zoning hearing, everybody shows up. Well, I don't want that in my backyard. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know where it's going to work. Form-based codes are designed to break from some of that. Predictable built results, high-quality public realm. Form-based code is a regulation adopted into law and a powerful alternative to conventional zoning. The big catch here is that you still have form, you still have use, you still have an administrative process, but form becomes the organizing principle, the more significant portion of how the code works. The public can see what's happening where. You can reflect a diversity of architecture, define and codify a neighborhood DNA. And if you do it right, it's concise, it's organized, it's written so non-planners can understand it, and it's a tool to achieve a desired outcome. Maybe not the only tool, it's one of the more integrated tools. It has benefits to the community, and you can code the outcome of a planning process. So it's like, I want to talk about more multifamily in my community, but my community is suspicious of that. We do a planning process. Everybody's like, well, I like multifamily if it feels like that and it works like this and it has these amenities. And now you go to do zoning and it's tough to actually do that. And it also can provide certainty to property owners about what's going on your lot and what's going on other lots nearby. So in Somerville, we set out to provide better customer service, strengthen protections for residential neighborhoods in terms of design, cut red tape for small business, guide redevelopment in transitioning areas, protect the arts economy, and create predictable community benefits. And I want to stress on the word predictable because we didn't want to negotiate community benefits case by case more often than we had to. We had a plan. We had the Summer Vision Plan, which we first passed in 2012. We had ambitious goals, 6,000 new housing units and 30,000 new jobs. We had areas we wanted to focus on. This green spaces are where I talked about the zoning being broken. We wanted to do incremental change there, but we also had areas on the eastern edge of the city where we could do transformational change. And we came up with a plan, 584 goals, policies, and actions, and 182 of them directly related to the zoning ordinance. So we knew we could knock off the biggest portion of our comprehensive plan simply by overhauling the zoning. And that's what we did. We started with meetings, and it did take years of meetings, of conversation, we discussed inclusionary zoning, particularly with advocates. So we had a lot of conversation with advocates. We measured in areas in the neighborhoods where everything was non-conforming. We actually measured what the urban form is. So if somebody wants to build a conforming two-family, we know what a conforming two-family looks like, and it can join our community in a way that isn't disruptive to the streetscape and the character around it. And we built a code where much of it, it's hundreds of pages because it is a citywide zoning code, but much of it is built on these 4-page spreads of how to do, for example, a mixed-use building in a 4-story district and what those provisions are. We simplified the use table and made many more things. The P are things by right. So like a consumer retail space is by right. No, you don't have to deal with the difference between a Turkish bath and potato chips like that place in California. Although we did regulate certain things. For some reason, alcohol, firearms, and pets are very, very controversial. Other than that, we found that you could do a lot. We put substantial sustainable development regulations in, but I'm not going to focus much on that today. And we tackled these 6 equity strategies, which I want to dig deeper into and show what we did in each case and how it can work in other communities. For missing middle housing, missing middle being that step between the single family and the sort of 500 unit projects like we have in Assembly Square where you build a podium building. everything from the townhouse to the courtyard building to a duplex. These are types of missing middle housing from Opticos's book on missing middle. That's the book by Daniel Perolik. But if you look at our urban residence district, a number of our mixed use districts have this too, but urban residence is really the missing middle district that we created. It's designed for up to 4 stories and it has these different building types. And each of these, you can select a type based upon your lot size and shape. You can build one of these types based upon the 4-page spread of how to do it. And so now, you can build an apartment house. It looks like a mansion, but it's an apartment, and it fits the character of those districts. Multiplex, the apartment building, and each of those are designed to work under those circumstances. We addressed accessory dwelling units, which can work in many communities. We created in our neighborhood residence district the backyard cottage type. One of the things that got a little bit interesting here is we wanted the backyard cottage to be added on top of 2 units. In the end of the day, the council did allow us to do this, but requires one of the 3 to be affordable, which I think, as a big advocate for affordable housing, we're still trying to see whether or not that particular circumstance with affordable restrictions on the backyard cottage actually results in this occurring, or if it stifles that particular market a little bit too much. That still remains to be seen, but we have the basic concept of a backyard cottage or converting a garage to an apartment. We really reduced parking requirements anywhere within a half-mile transit, basically to 0. We put maximums on our large-scale districts. But I think even more interesting, we built for some of our biggest projects these rules on mobility management where applicants have to prove that they are providing strategies for people to use the transit that's next to their project rather than simply having transit next to their project, but we actually make it transit oriented. Many of them are providing T-passes, joining transit management associations, and making sure that we actually are in a position where we can have mobility strategies that rely on walk, bike, transit, so that at the same time as we reduce parking, we have those other alternatives available. We made outcomes more predictable. Now, there are still SP special permits all over this code, but there are a lot fewer of them. And where they do exist, the findings required are very specific. In some cases, our elected, I would have liked to have household living be a P across the board, that top line in the mixed use districts. We ended up with housing still requiring the special permit once you get to the mixed use districts. Not ideal, but that's the world of political compromise, and nonetheless, it's a lot more straightforward what you're doing under those circumstances. You can, build a 2-family house in the neighborhood residence or a 4-story apartment building in urban residence by right, which is a huge step forward in terms of creating predictable outcomes. Adding inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning, basically requiring a portion of units be set aside as affordable, can make a lot of sense. It can make a lot of sense when it's calibrated correctly. I urge you to be very careful to lean on this tool as the solution to all challenges. It's basically telling the development community to finance housing affordability, which works as long as it is financially viable to do so. A lot of communities I've seen end up using inclusionary housing in a way that results in putting so much financial burden on a project that nothing gets built, and that defeats the purpose of affordable housing. It turns into a NIMBY strategy rather than an affordable housing strategy. So you have to do the financial analysis to make sure it works. You have to calibrate. What I like about inclusionary and form-based codes is they work really well together in terms of making sure that you can capture value from new density. So I'll use a form-based code, I'll make a district allow more intensity of development. I'll add inclusionary at that exact moment in time, so that as I'm adding value, I'm capturing some of that value back for the community in terms of inclusionary units. So the benefit can be significant. The key is getting the regulatory dials right with inclusionary, the density at which you trigger it, the percentage that you require, how you set income categories. If you ask for 20% of units at 50% of AMI, you may find that you have created a situation where you've made development infeasible. So you got to be very careful about how you turn all of these, and then like how you generate. So ours has 2 different income categories, well, 3 income categories now, and there's a whole formula for which units are delivered at what category. Then there's all these other questions. You can't write an inclusionary ordinance without addressing these fractional units. Do you want to allow people to pay or go off site instead? We do that very, very rarely now in Somerville. Some communities like to require units to be bigger. Some have bonuses on top of, you can do 5% inclusionary, but you can do, if you do 10% inclusionary, you can do all these other things. Then we get into this whole question in a community where we're trying to reduce parking, and someone builds a modest sized lot at 0.5 spaces per unit. Then the question is, do the inclusionary units get some of those parking spaces, and how do you calculate that? So it's tricky, but we have it, we've had it, we've imported it into the form-based code. We have 3 tiers of area median income relative to inclusionary units, a whole concept of how many units are required at different unit types. We're studying very closely the smaller unit types because I'm a little worried we crossed the line of financial feasibility in certain areas, and I want to understand that better. But we're having a lot of success in the bigger projects in terms of inclusionary. And then implementation, it's never easy. Our code is form-based, but the inclusionary section is a lot of writing, because that's what you need in order to do that. And then the most interesting new concept, and Cambridge, Massachusetts did this ahead of us, and we just adopted something similar, is affordable housing overlay. What we found is our developers who are doing 100% affordable housing are often finding they're competing against speculators for land and overpaying, and then they come back to our housing trust and we're paying a lot to be able to get affordable housing off the ground. What our affordable housing overlay does is it allows our communities to be in a position where the affordable housing developers can compete on sites because they can build higher density than conventional builders on the same site. And so just to step back to that for a second, what that has allowed us to do is allow us to say that, on this site, you might be able to build 10 units, but if you're building a 100% affordable project, you can build a little bit more height, a little bit less setback, and build maybe 15 units, and suddenly the per unit cost becomes more affordable for an affordable housing developer, and it allows them a little bit of a leg up in a competitive market. I want to finish today, though, with a little discussion about Mass General Law 40A, everybody's favorite topic, the Zoning Act at the state level. And I think that, you can see we've done a lot. We've done a form-based code, we've done building types, we've done all of these strategies to try to address equity. There'll probably be more. We're still amending the code as we're getting better ideas. And I have spent a substantial portion of my professional career working with folks trying to amend 40A and get to a more modern zoning act for Massachusetts. I still believe it's important, but I also don't believe that it should be leaned on as the reason why we can't do innovative things now. 40A is frustrating, but let's not let it frustrate efforts for equity. There's plenty of space within 40A to do what we need to do if we work with it correctly. And yet, I understand, I still want to advocate for more to repair it. First of all, the lawyer friends say this to me a lot, and I feel like it's important to note that 40A is not enabling legislation. Many states have zoning enabling laws that enable you to do zoning at the local level. We need to sometimes remind ourselves that Massachusetts is still supposed to be a home rule state. Zoning rights to local governments come from the Home Rule Amendment of the state constitution. That's what allows you to do zoning. What 40A does is it basically puts a box around what you can do. It says, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. But if you take all the can'ts out and it's not there, you still should be able to do it, upon the advice and consent of local counsel, of course. I don't want anyone to not check with their local lawyers. But it has troubles. It provides lack of direction on site plan review and design review. It doesn't have that line that says form-based codes are allowed that we tried for years to get in. It has really strict scheduling provisions on project reviews, which can be really frustrating. And you can't regulate building material in the code, and you can't add impact fees under case law related to 40A. That's frustrating. You want to do a form-based code, you want to say, okay, but I want to make sure that you do this and that with building material and then make it by right. They don't let you do that. You end up adding a site plan review process just so you can regulate building material. I've seen some places actually do that. That's frustrating, but it works. Like, you can get around it. There is no limit to form-based codes. Site plan review has been allowed by the courts, which is a great between special permits that are discretionary and the chance to still do a design review while you're still getting to a yes if necessary. And don't underestimate the value of the uniformity provision in 48, which says very simply that within a certain type or class of building in a district, you have to be uniform. It doesn't say everything in the district has to be uniform. It says you have to be uniform by a type of building, which for form-based codes is great, because if you build a triple-decker building type or a duplex building type, the duplex only has to be internally consistent with itself. It doesn't have to be consistent with other building types. The code, the language in 48 leads you to a building type based form-based code if that's what you want to do. It actually, and the uniformity position is what you can lean on to make that happen. We do have some good news. We had the breakthrough recently on the dreaded 2/3 rule that required you to get 2/3 of city council or town meeting in order to make a change to zoning. And that breakthrough, I think, has been pretty significant in that it allows you to use a majority vote to do a zoning amendment if that zoning amendment is adding housing capacity. What is most interesting and really intriguing about this rule is you need a majority vote to add housing, and you still need the 2/3 vote to take it back away again. So if you do that vote and you do something successful and you create a district that adds housing density and you had that really close, but you got over the minority, the majority 1/2 provision in a town meeting vote, and then suddenly people are starting to pull a petition to pull a rug out from under your zoning and put it back the way it was before, suddenly they need a 2/3 vote to put it back the other way. I think that's a really interesting provision in the code. It does create a problem for overhauls though. You know, be very careful because overhauls now have to sort out what's a housing provision and what isn't, what's a 2/3 vote, what's a majority vote. And the next opportunity and challenge is that the same legislation coming from the state, from the governor, requires 175 communities in Massachusetts to allow multifamily housing near their transit stations. And we are anxiously awaiting the ruling of how that's all going to work and what those next steps are going to be in terms of what communities have to do to prove that they meet that requirement. I think it's going to be an interesting opportunity for communities to really do the planning. I'm hoping there's financial assistance too to help think this out and make it possible to be able to get to the point where we can figure out how to have more conversations about multifamily by right near transit as a strategy in Massachusetts, and one that is contextual to a neighborhood. So I'll leave it there.
George, thank you very much. I learned a lot about Turkish baths, so that was interesting. You know, and I couldn't agree with you more about Chapter 40A in the non-enabling aspects of it. And you know, I've also been part of the conversations on zoning reform, and I'll just say one editorial thing, you know, that stood in the way for decades on reform is, I know I'm a heretic when I say this in the planning community in Massachusetts, but an unhealthy obsession with approval not required plans has been a major political sticking point for many years in terms of an overhaul. So things like the incremental changes that we just saw with the governor's housing choice can get done when they're not coupled with some of those other pieces of baggage along the way. That's my only editorial point. Let's bring on the other folks back into the conversation here, Tracy and Marcus. And while we do, George, a question for you on your presentation here from the participants. When you were doing the form-based code in Somerville, you know, beyond the inclusionary zoning pieces of this, you know, was there a conversation about the intersection of sort of the flexibility in zoning and making sure that there are financeable opportunities, you know, for non-conventional types of forms, non-conventional types of projects? Was there a conversation around that during the process?
There were many moments around the table with the staff where we were working on that. I'm not sure how. There were fewer conversations in the public about making sure things work financially. There were a lot of conversations amongst us to make sure that, and some at the council meeting, to make sure, you know, where, you know, community members might say, oh, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And we're like, all right, we're very concerned about crossing that financial line. One of the ones, you know, not really on the issues of the world of equity, but very interestingly was, you know, we put LEED Platinum requirements in for large buildings, and were substantially over and over again told we were going to kill the biotech lab market in Somerville by doing that. I'm permitting, I think, 6 LEED Platinum lab buildings right now, so I'm a lot less worried about that than I was before. But we spent a lot of time worried about that and thinking about that to make sure we didn't cross that infeasible line on projects.
Thank you. I'm sure you all have questions for each other here, but I do want to just start us off because the theme with all three of you, you touched on transformative placemaking, you touched on, you know, use and form-based codes, Marcus and George. to Marcus's presentation, when you talked about equality, right, sort of the level playing field, and then in practice, the equity piece of this. Question for everybody here. So if you take the use-based paradigm and you go to a form-based paradigm of zoning, does that equalize, the equality and equity conversation? How does that play out, I guess, in the actual implementation of form-based codes? And what would be the pitfalls with form-based codes that might take us back over that edge, in terms of taking an equal code, but again, having unintentional inequitable outcomes? So I'll throw that in there in the mix. If anyone wants to.
I mean, I'll just mention one thought on that. Form-based codes is a tool. I mean, you can form-based code a Walmart in a parking lot if you want to. I wouldn't advise you to use it for that purpose. Zoning is a concept that we are more and more aware now was sort of built on a racist foundation. And one of the challenges, I think, surrounding that is that I am very concerned, but that there's this pull about, well, what's the solution to that? Is it to tear zoning down? But if you put nothing to replace it in a community like mine, you'll actually have rampant land speculation and things will get more expensive. It won't be a solution. But so our solution to some extent to racist zoning is more zoning. And that does worry me, but I do think that the form-based code is a tool that allows you to kind of reset the conversation, sort of build it on a new foundation. You can still go awry. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, but you start from a point where you can recalibrate how you think about it. So it's not the solution. It's a tool in the toolkit. That's the way I see it.
To what George said, I would add that, yes, zoning is a tool. And it's a tool that in the past, communities have primarily used to say what they don't want. If communities want to start moving to better outcomes, they need to use zoning to say what they do want. And to George's point, that the answer is certainly not to say nothing. And, whether it's a form-based code or whether it's still something that's use-driven, I think it is really, there are some uncomfortable conversations involved in communities saying what they truly want and having it and confronting what values undergird those aspirations. So those are kind of the bigger picture conversations that need to have before picking up the tool and going back to work.
And I won't say too much on it, but I will say, George, I like the word you use. Form-based codes allow us to sort of level set a little bit, focusing more on the public realm as opposed to what goes in a building. But then I do think the things that I think a lot of cities are going to have to grapple with are these economic obstacles that are now still in the place of getting the newer types of developments built as a byproduct of the form-based code. In addition to the technical know-how, particularly in these sort of lower income people of color communities, which for a couple of decades now haven't been a part of the development community for so long, right? And so it's almost like we're having to reteach how to design the cities that we used to build before we had zoning, and those sort of basic principles that used to make up our cities in general. So I think form-based codes, part of the solution, the foundation of the solution, I would argue, but then how do we now tackle some of these other economic and institutional knowledge obstacles that are now still pervasive in some communities as well?
How long do you think transformation will, if there's a form-based world, it's not going to happen overnight, but how do you folks view sort of the timeline to sort of repair the social fabric, repair the sprawl, transform the places that are in urban or rural types of communities, if we're kind of using this tool? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I'm a firm believer that as much as, and this is with anything, but as much time as you put into going in one direction, it's almost like you almost need that same amount of time in the opposite direction, if not more, to reverse what you put into place. We've been operating with Euclidean zoning for almost 90 years now, right? And it's just so pervasive and impregnated into our psyche as Americans. And to George's point, I think we're just now starting to realize some of the foundations of what we've been doing for so long. And so you have these small pockets that are really making some progressive changes to their zoning codes and getting some efforts, some good byproducts of that, because they have this sort of comprehensive solution, change the zoning, change the regulations, but also empower people, empower locals. But I think by and large, I'm interested to hear what the other panelists have to say, but it may take us to really see some continental change. It may take us another 70, 80 years to really see that scale of change.
My answer is a little different because I think it depends on where you are. I think that zoning is the regulatory context in, part of the regulatory context in which change happens, but it is not in and of itself a catalyst or a driver of change. So you can change all your zoning and then nothing can happen, right? Especially, like the issue that most communities in the United States are dealing with is that they're stagnating or declining, actually, and not that like there's too much change. And this is even true in parts of Massachusetts. So, even within Massachusetts, there are some communities where the context is stagnation or decline. And, zoning is like one of a host of issues that a community might be dealing with. But in high growth areas, and this is a big chunk of Massachusetts, change actually can come really quickly. If you get the regulatory context right, you can go from being a place that has no ADU permits being pulled in a given year to having 1,000 pulled. You can go from being a place that has vacant land or extremely marginal land uses like parking next to your transit station to having a high rise next to your transit station. I mean, in high growth areas, the driver of change is demand. And there is, in a lot of these high growth areas, an almost unbearable amount of pent up demand because we've been building the wrong thing in the wrong places for so long. That pent up demand, if unconstrained by zoning, would be constrained only by other aspects of processes that regulate change, by the supply chain, by the availability of labor. Those things will end up being the constraints. But I think actually in high growth areas, it is possible to see transformation in less than a decade. And that's what other communities that have implemented reforms have seen. This doesn't always have to be like, generational or multi-generational change. This is something that can happen in between two censuses.
George.
I'm just going to say, I mean, what's interesting is, we did Assembly Square in Somerville. For those who haven't seen it, it's Federal Realty Investment Trust project, mixed use, hundreds of units of housing on a vacant site just by adding a transit station there. In the 20 years it took us to talk about, consider, and get to the point of groundbreaking at Assembly, which was a really difficult process in Massachusetts for a bunch of reasons. We had an excellent community advocacy group who pushed us away from strip malls and towards mixed use there, and that was a big part of what happened. But the DC metro area probably built 7 projects like that in the time that we were talking about it. So I know it's possible to kind of move us in a certain direction if we can get ourselves in line and have pro-growth community groups and things like that. The only thing I'll add is the Metro Mayor's Coalition talks about 185,000 units of housing in the region. We are in the core of Boston, a really intense growth demand area. It wouldn't be a bad outcome of all of this current change if some of that demand shifted to the western part of our state. if there was the opportunity, whether it be through high-speed transit or through ways to build more growth in other communities, if the places that are financially stagnating in our community could actually share in some of that growth, I think they would like it, and I think the inner core would like it too, because it would. And I think the key is, getting to the point where there are the economic drivers to want to bring walkable, mixed-use, interesting places, and more people who want to live in places that are more stagnant. So I think there's some real challenges there, and some real opportunities too.
Right. And George, I agree with most of what you said. The one little bit of pushback that I would hand out here is that realistically, you don't need to look as far as Western Massachusetts to look for how kind of regionally, there is like a smart and inclusive way to think about growth. If you look at what's already happening in the Boston MSA, we're seeing dramatically greater integration of Worcester and Providence. And realistically, that's the kind of lines along which local governments need to be thinking about cooperation, and in which the region needs to be thinking about growth.
Wow, thank you so much, Marcus, Tracy, and George. Fantastic. And 2 hours goes by in a flash. It's unbelievable. And these past 5 sessions have been absolutely superb. If I was going to have a dinner party, you'd all be invited, because it would be a pretty cool conversation all the way back to the first session. It'd be a really fantastic way to have some wine and some good food. So Mark is back here from Smart Growth America. I just want to say, thank you again to SGA and Barr Foundation, and everybody who's been involved in this, from Jill to Catherine Burgess, to Tola, who had left SGA just a few sessions ago. It's just been a great series. It's all available on YouTube. Please put your comments in the chat. I think Marta had put the link there for the comments on this session. Please use that as well. And I'll hand it back to you, Marta, and then thanks again to the panel.
Thanks. I just want to add my thanks on behalf of Smart Growth America to all of the panelists, and great work for the LOCUS staff who've been working on this entire series, as you mentioned. And Doug, I just want to, as we wrap up, express a special thanks on behalf of LOCUS and Smart Growth America for all of your work on this. You've done a terrific job. You put a lot of time into planning it and helping us organize it and moderating all 5 sessions. And they have been much better and much more relevant because of your involvement. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of you. And we look forward to seeing you all again. It's an interesting topic, which Form-Based Codes Institute with Smart Growth America has continued to work on. And this has been extremely helpful in that thought leadership. So thanks a lot. And everybody have a good rest of your day.
Happy 2022.